Well, as we said, it was the Conservative government that signed the deal for the armoured vehicles with the Saudis back in 2014. Ed Fast was the Minister of International Trade back then, and he's joining me now from the foyer of the House of Commons tonight. Mr. Fast, good to speak with you again.
Good to be on your show again.
There's lots of mystery around exactly how much in billions of dollars the penalty to Canada could be if the government cancelled the LAV deal with the Saudis. What can you tell us about that, since you helped put the deal together?
Well, firstly, I didn't help put the deal together. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what happens with these large defense transactions. Canada has a crown corporation by the name of Canadian Commercial Corporation.
Fair enough, yeah.
And it acts really as a surety or as a guarantor of the obligations of a Canadian company that has entered into a contract to sell defense products abroad. And the actual negotiation of the contract itself takes place between the company and that foreign country. Mm-hmm. And of course, that business has to go and provide pilots and testing for those vehicles, which happened in this case. GDLS, which is the Canadian company here, was up against some really tough competition from France and from Germany. But at the end of the day, the Saudis made the decision they wanted to have our LAVs.
Right. But you were inside the process to the point where you know the answer to what penalties are involved, right? But actually, I don't know if you can tell us, do you?
I can't tell you exactly. I know there are penalties involved, but it's not the role of the minister to drill down into the details of the contract because there's a lot of confidentiality involved. There are also privacy concerns even now.
Right.
I'm not sure the public will actually have access to the full contract that was signed. Suffice it to say that the federal government's role was to ensure that GDLS met its obligations, and we did that through the Canadian Commercial Corporation.
What were your concerns then? I mean, because it would be the government's role as well to factor in concerns about human rights. What were your concerns then about allowing a deal to go ahead that would supply the Saudi regime with Canadian military vehicles?
Well, we had concerns at that time, and a full assessment was done as to the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. An assessment was done as to whether these vehicles had potential of being used against the civilian population. It's my understanding that there were terms and covenants that were imposed on the Saudis that they would not do that. But remember, at that time, the Yemeni war hadn't started. It certainly hadn't percolated to the point it is now. And so the decision was made to move ahead with this contract, a $15 billion contract, money coming from Saudi Arabia into Canada's economy.
So now, I mean, this has all been precipitated by the death of a dissident Saudi journalist, and it's put the spotlight back on the Saudi human rights record. Having been at least part of the party and the structure that put this deal through, do you have any doubts now? I mean, should we walk away from it now?
You know what? Before we walk away from it, we have to do a full assessment of what's in Canada's interest. Remember, we have other tools available that are likely going to be more effective. Canceling the contract simply means Saudi Arabia goes to another country and buys similar vehicles.
But Canada does get, some people would say Canada does get to say, we stood up for the human rights piece and go ahead.
Yes.
We'll
Yes.
take the economic hit and
Yes.
buy your vehicles somewhere else, but we're standing up for the human rights piece.
Yeah, but you know, Peter, if all we're doing is punishing Canadians and the 3,000 jobs in Southern Ontario and everything that's attached to that, I know the NDP was saying, yeah, just cancel this deal. And they had no response, really, when people said, well, what do we do with these 3,000 workers that'll be out of a job? All they said was, well, they'll find other jobs. That's pretty flippant. I think this is important to take into account. Is there a better way of punishing the Saudis? Remember, the Saudi deal is about $15 billion coming into Canada. Our best leverage is on oil because we send billions of dollars out of Canada to buy oil from the Saudis. If we had the pipeline infrastructure in place that could get our oil to the eastern coast, to the eastern marketplace, we could become self-sufficient in Canada. We wouldn't need Saudi oil.
Right. But I guess I'd say is maintaining the contract for the LAVs with Saudi Arabia in keeping with Canada's stated desire to defend human rights around the world?
Well, you know, that's an assessment that the Liberal government is going to have to make. But I will tell you this. Before we take any steps that are going to hurt Canadians And before we take any steps that are going to cancel a contract that's going to be done on the back of hardworking Canadians, we need to assess some of the other options we have available. I mentioned this one about Saudi oil. We can cancel that if we had the infrastructure in place. Secondly, we have the Magnitsky Act, which can be applied to impose very serious sanctions against Saudi nationals that have been involved in this very, very nefarious affair.
All right, Mr. Fast, we'll leave it at there tonight. It was good to get your perspective, and thanks for taking the time.
You're welcome.